Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. The countdown has begun. New Delhi is gearing up to host arguably the biggest diplomatic event in its history, the G20 Leaders' Summit. China has finally confirmed today that Xi Jinping will not come. If the idea was to undermine India's presidency, it's a case of China cutting its nose to spite its face. It erodes their already weak relationship with Europe. It undermines Xi Jinping's global standing, and it shows that they put petty politics over the interests of the global south. As news of Xi's absence was confirmed, India also began border drills in the Himalayas. We'll bring you the full story. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president has fired his defense minister in the middle of the war. We will tell you why. Turkey's president went to Russia to convince Vladimir Putin to revive the Black Sea grain deal. What was Putin's response? We'll discuss that. Why is Nepal complaining about China's new map? Why is Pakistan's army chief meeting business leaders? Why the custody battle of an NRI mother in Australia has become a diplomatic issue. Why Italy is exiting the Belt and Road Initiative. What's happening in the coup-hit countries of Niger and Gabon. And are there microplastics in your brain? All this and more coming up. The headlines first. South Africa says there is no evidence it's applied arms to Russia. President Cyril Ramaphosa says an independent investigation has found no proof. Last December, the US envoy to South Africa had alleged a Russian ship was loaded with arms near Cape Town. Pretoria has maintained good ties with Moscow despite its invasion of Ukraine, prompting criticism from the West. Malaysia drops corruption charges against its Deputy Prime Minister Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, was facing 47 charges of graft and money laundering, but the court said this was not an acquittal. Zahid was appointed Deputy Prime Minister after elections in November last year. This is after his party joined the ruling coalition of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Japan is reeling under the Fukushima backlash. Tokyo increases its aid for the fishing sector by over $140 million. Japan's decision to release wastewater from the nuclear plant has angered China. Beijing has banned Japanese seafood. China is Japan's biggest overseas market for seafood. The Africa Climate Summit begins in Kenya. More than a dozen African leaders are attending the first edition of this summit. Kenyan President Ruto wants rich nations to be held accountable. The United Nations says Africa accounts for only 2 to 3% of the world's carbon emissions, but is the worst affected by global warming. And Iran shuts down a water park for violating hijab rules. The water park was closed for allowing women entry without the headscarf. Here in India, we love guests. The hospitality, the respect, all of it comes naturally to us. But this respect is supposed to be a two-way street. You give and take respect. Someone should tell that to Xi Jinping. He was supposed to be India's guest at the G20 summit, but he won't be coming. He's pulled out at the last minute. Now, to be fair, the chances of Xi Jinping coming were always low. We kept hearing reports of his possible absence in New Delhi, but until today, it was not confirmed. It was not official. And that signals China's intentions. Because Xi Jinping is not the only leader who is not coming to India. Vladimir Putin is not coming either. But look at how Putin handled his absence. He called up Prime Minister Modi last Monday. He personally informed Modi about his decision. Compare that to Xi Jinping. He let the rumor spread. He allowed the speculation to grow, and just 5 days before the summit, he makes it official. No explanation, no phone call to the host country, just a statement during China's regular briefing.
At the invitation of the Government of the Republic of India, Premier of the State Council Li Qiang will attend the 18th G20 summit held in New Delhi of India on September 9 and 10.
So Xi Jinping won't come. Instead, his number two, the Chinese premier, will attend. Why could that be? Let's look at the backdrop of this G20 summit. It is being hosted by India, arguably China's biggest regional rival. The last 1 month has been very different for India and China. India landed a spacecraft on the moon. India is also the fastest growing major economy in the world. So the whole world was cheering us on. And China? The exact opposite. Their economy is slowing down. Every day there is talk of a debt bubble bursting. Now imagine you're Xi Jinping. If you come for the G20, you give India more press coverage. Meanwhile, you end up being just one of the 20. But by not coming, you make the headlines. You snub the hosts and the West. That seems to be Xi Jinping's thinking. He was more than happy to visit South Africa for the BRICS summit. And why not? China faces no criticism within the BRICS. In fact, Xi got the biggest red carpet in Johannesburg. But in New Delhi, he won't. Chances are he will face questions and criticism. So rather than face it, Xi Jinping has chosen to skip it. And frankly, it's a missed opportunity. Because the Chinese president rarely travels abroad. So meetings like the G20 are a good chance to mingle with friends, with allies, and with rivals. US President Joe Biden was hoping for a meeting with Xi Jinping. He says he's disappointed by Xi's decision.
I am disappointed, but I'm going to get to see him. Thank you.
Normally we say speculation does not help. But in this case, perhaps it does. It's important to understand why Xi Jinping is not coming. Is it because he thinks the G20 is worthless? Is he moving on to BRICS Plus? If so, the G20 faces a big challenge because China, at the end of the day, is home to 1.4 billion people. It is also the second largest economy in the world. So a G20 without China is certainly less influential. But on paper, Beijing has denied this. They claim to attach, quote-unquote, great importance to the G20. Listen to this.
I can tell you that the G20 is a major forum for international economic cooperation. China has always attached great importance to and actively participated in relevant activities.
Which brings us to the second possibility, the one we mentioned at the start. His differences with India. The border dispute in Ladakh is yet to be resolved, and now there is talk of a new flashpoint, water. India and China share the Brahmaputra river system. China has 11 dams on this river. What's more, it is located upstream. Experts believe China can squeeze India's supply in case of a war. So what is New Delhi doing? Making dams of its own. Last month, India decided to revive 12 hydropower projects, basically dams. All of them are located in Arunachal Pradesh. Put together, these dams will cost around $15 billion. Reports say they have two purposes. One is the obvious one, to generate electricity. The second is strategic, to protect against China's upstream advantage. India is also making some military moves. The Air Force has begun major drills along the border with China and Pakistan. It is called Exercise Trishul. And the Air Force has called in the big guns for this one. Fighter jets like the Rafale and the Sukhois will be taking part. So will C-17 carriers and attack helicopters. The drills will run from today until the 14th of September, which means throughout the G20, this drill will be on. If Xi's absence was China's message to India, then these drills are India's message to China. And it's an important message because Xi Jinping's absence is not a reflection of New Delhi's presidency. India can only invite people. India cannot force them to come. So this episode reflects more on Xi Jinping himself, his failures at home, his differences with the West, and his inability to lead the global South. There is one more leader who's not coming, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. He wanted to attend the G20 summit, but he did not get an invite. Ukraine is not a G20 member, although the war in Ukraine will feature prominently in the conversations this weekend. And just ahead of the summit, there's been a shake-up in Kiev. The defense minister has been sacked. His name is Oleksiy Reznikov. Reznikov was made defense minister in November 2021, and during the war, he emerged as an important figure. He built up support for Ukraine in the West. One of his key tasks was to lobby for powerful weapons, and he did it. But in recent weeks, some reports emerged. They said his days in the defense ministry were numbered. And yesterday, President Zelensky put an end to the speculation. He confirmed Reznikov's exit.
This
week, the Parliament will be asked to make a staff-related decision. I would like to outline it now. I have decided to replace the Defense Minister of Ukraine. Oleksiy Reznikov has been through more than 550 days of full-scale war. I believe that the ministry needs new approaches and other formats of interaction with both the military and society as a whole.
A new approach, that's what the president wants. And it is a fact that the current approach is not working. A few weeks back, Ukraine launched a counter-offensive. There was a lot of hype around it. They wanted to retake occupied territory. They wanted to push the Russians back. None of it is happening. It proved to be a costly and futile exercise. And now there's going to be a change of guard. Does that mean Ukraine will wrap up the counter-offensive? It's hard to say, but one thing is quite clear. Reznikov's exit is not just about military strategy. It is also about other things. There is more to this story. Two broad reasons behind his exit: corruption and narrative building. Now, corruption is an old issue in Ukraine, especially in the defense establishment. It is mired in graft cases. There have been serious allegations. One of the cases is about military rations. They were bought at inflated prices. And what was the value of this contract? More than $1 billion. The case came to light earlier this year, and soon it snowballed into a major controversy. Reznikov was the defense minister then, but he did not sign the contract, and yet he was the one who came under fire for it. The civil society criticized him. They said the buck stops with the defense minister. He, on his part, called it a smear campaign. He pushed back against the criticism, but he wasn't really able to sway public opinion. Because this is not a one-off. Ukraine's army is plagued by corruption. Multiple scandals have come to light. Corruption in medical exemptions was investigated. Conscription officials were caught taking bribes. And some cases are truly incredible, like this one. Ukraine's enlistment offices were audited. One recruitment chief was caught. Doing what? Using soldiers as his personal servants. They were sent to his private estate and used in construction activity. Soldiers. All of this happened on Reznikov's watch. So while he wasn't personally implicated in any case, on the anti-corruption front, he seemed ineffective. And perhaps Zelensky thought a change was necessary. Also, Western allies have poured billions of dollars into this war. The last thing they would want is for that money to be lost in corruption. And they would ask questions if they're not asking them already. Hence the sacking. Reason number two could be the need to build a new narrative. Meet Rustem Umerov, the man who will be Ukraine's new defense minister. He used to be an investment banker and a member of Ukraine's opposition. But since the beginning of this war, Umerov has donned the hat of a negotiator. He's been involved in prisoner exchanges. Also, the Black Sea grain deal, the one brokered by the United Nations, a deal to secure grain exports from Ukraine to the world. Umerov was Ukraine's chief negotiator for that deal. Recently, that deal fell apart, Russia walked out, and talks are on to revive it. So why did Zelensky choose this man for the defense minister's post? Is he preparing to negotiate with Russia? Well, it's a possibility. Kiev could also be trying to send a message to Moscow. Umerov belongs to the Crimean Tatar community. It's an ethnic group in Crimea, a region that Russia took in 2014. They annexed it in 2014. And since then, these Crimeans are said to have been persecuted. Umerov has been speaking about this. In fact, I have a quote from him from 2021. He said, "The deportation of Crimean Tatars is one of the greatest crimes of the Soviet regime. It was started by the tyrants in power at that time in order to exterminate an entire nation." So this appointment could be a political message. And what happens to Reznikov? He could get a different job. Some reports say he could be Ukraine's next ambassador to the UK. We'll have to wait and see. Either way, Zelensky is shifting gears. What about Russia? Their president, Vladimir Putin, is not coming to the G20 either, although he did get an invite. Instead, Putin is going to China next month. And ahead of that visit, China is extending more support to Moscow. Russian banks are raising money from China. Leading Chinese banks have stepped in. They're giving loans worth billions to Moscow. Which banks are these? Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, Bank of China, China Construction Bank, and Agricultural Bank of China. These are among China's top banks. How much is their exposure to Russian banks? Almost $10 billion now. Russia depends more on Chinese banks now. It says it does not want to trade in what it calls toxic currencies. That's the term they use, toxic currencies, like the dollar and the euro. Trade between Russia and China has also grown. Chinese exports to Russia have risen. And what are the Russians buying? Things like microchips, trench digging excavators, goods that can potentially be used by the Russian military. These are called dual-use goods. They are both civilian and military applications. This is what China is giving to Russia. And Moscow can use all the support it gets as the war takes a new turn. Yet another drone attack was reported today on a building in Kurchatov. This is near the Ukraine border. Reports say Russia's intelligence services were using this building. The attack did not cause a lot of physical damage, but perhaps that was not even the idea. Ukraine has taken the war inside Russia. It has changed its defense minister, and it's working on building a new narrative. Expect more action in the weeks ahead. And speaking of going beyond enemy lines, here's what Turkish President Erdogan is doing. Here's where he is, at least technically. Erdogan traveled to Sochi today to meet Vladimir Putin. It's a Russian resort town on the Black Sea. There was a lot of speculation around this meeting. It wasn't clear when or where this meeting would happen. First, Putin was expected to visit Turkey, and that would have been huge. The Russian president meeting a NATO leader inside NATO territory. Maybe that's why the plan was dropped. But finally, they picked Sochi. Putin welcomed Erdogan with a handshake and a smile. Afterwards, they got down to business. The big issue was the Black Sea grain deal. Erdogan was pushing Russia to revive it, but today he had no luck. Putin said the deal cannot be revived unless his conditions are met. Listen to this.
As I have said more than once, we were simply forced to make this decision. Russia was forced to do it, as Western countries blocked and continue to block the grain deal in terms of ensuring access of Russian agricultural producers to world markets. Well, it can't be tolerated further.
Not surprising though, Russia's actions always suggested this would happen. Take a look at these pictures. They show the Ukrainian town of Odessa on fire. It was attacked by Russian drones on Sunday. At least 2 people were injured. Now, Odessa is a port town. Ukrainian grain is shipped from Odessa to the world. So why did Russia attack it? To send a message that their position will not change. So Putin's decision is not surprising, really. But one of his comments stood out. He said there is no shortage of food grains. There is only a distribution problem. Listen to this.
The termination of the grain deal did not affect the global food markets. I would like to emphasize this in particular. No matter what is said about this, grain prices continue to decline. There is no physical shortage of food. There are problems with its fair distribution, that's true. But this has nothing to do with the so-called grain deal.
Well, technically he's right. There is a distribution problem. But many people would say that the problem is Russia, that Putin's position is making a bad situation worse. Erdogan knew this would be the likely outcome today, but he pushed for it anyway. The Turkish president wants Ukraine to soften its stance, to strike a deal.
In this context, we prepared a package containing new suggestions in consultation with the United Nations. I think it's possible to get results with this new process. As Turkey, we believe that we will hopefully reach a solution that will meet expectations in a short time. Especially Ukraine needs to soften its approach on the point of being able to take mutual steps with Russia.
So the big headline is this: the Black Sea grain deal will not be revived. At least not today, which makes you wonder, why is this deal so important? Time for a quick recap. The Black Sea is located to the south of Ukraine. It is the only way to ship anything out of the country, out of Ukraine. But when Russia invaded, they blocked the Black Sea. They said all vessels were fair game, even commercial ones carrying food grains. This is when the United Nations and Turkey got together. They brokered a deal between Russia and Ukraine. And what did the deal say? That Ukraine could ship food grains from 3 ports. And in return, Russia got some concessions. They were allowed to sell food and fertilizers. In July 2023, this deal was up for renewal. Putin said, we won't do it. He said the West was not keeping its word, that Russian food exports faced a lot of restrictions. Which brings us to present day. Only 3 Ukrainian ships have left the Black Sea since July. All 3 without Russia's permission. If Moscow wants to, they can attack these ships. I'm sure all of this sounds complicated, but I bet you too have felt its impact. Wheat prices have increased 10% since July. Food inflation is rising globally. One of the reasons is the collapse of this deal. Just ask Erdogan, why do you think he's brokering this deal? It's certainly not because of compassion. Erdogan is doing it for political gains. Turkey's inflation was almost 60% in August. It was 47% the month before. To make matters worse, Erdogan thinks he's a financial genius. He doesn't believe in interest hikes. He thinks cutting interest rates will control inflation. Clearly, it's not working. But who will tell that to Erdogan? He needs this grain deal to cool prices down at home. If not, he needs a backup plan. And guess who has one? Vladimir Putin. He has presented a proposal to Erdogan, 1 million tons of Russian grain at discounted prices. Talk about a sweetener. Turkey gets the food grain and Russia gets Erdogan off their back. It's not clear if Ankara will accept this deal. But one thing is quite clear, Putin will keep leveraging food grains. He realizes it's the best way to put pressure on NATO. Having said that, it is a double-edged sword. So far, most of the developing world has refused to condemn Russia's war. Will they keep doing that when inflation hits double digits? When Russian rockets destroy Ukrainian grain? That's the risk for Putin. Meanwhile, China's map war is backfiring. This is about the map they released last week, what they call China's new standard map. It was issued by the government. We told you about it, about how in this map, China claims Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh and almost the entire South China Sea. The map was widely condemned. India, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam and the Philippines, all of them rejected China's claims. Now, one more country has been added to the list, and that country is Nepal. That's right, Nepal too is angry with China's new map, but not in the way you would imagine. You see, Nepal borders 2 countries, India and China. It has territorial disputes with both the countries. But it's not raising its disputes with China. This complaint is about Nepal's territorial claim against India and China's lack of support for it. Let me explain. In this map, China has marked 3 territories as Indian: Lipu Lake, Kalapani and Limpiadura. China's map says these territories are part of India, and that's not sitting well with Kathmandu. So the Nepalese government has issued a statement, an appeal to the international community, along with an old map that they released in 2020. Nepal had issued this map, a political map, 3 years ago. It claimed 3 territories in it: Lipu Lake, Kalapani, Limpiadura, as Nepalese territory. And their statement says, and I'm quoting, "The government unequivocally believes that this map must be respected by our neighbors as well as the international community." That's what Nepal is saying. In other words, they want China to follow this map. And Nepal is very serious about it. It wants to raise the issue diplomatically. The current Prime Minister of Nepal is called Pushp Kamal Dahal, more commonly known by his nickname Prachand. Now, Prachand will travel to China soon, and he's expected to discuss China's new map. Kathmandu's mayor was also supposed to go. His visit was supposed to begin this Thursday, but it's been called off. Again, due to the same map, the mayor will not go. He says he's cancelled the trip on quote-unquote moral grounds. Plus, there were protests. Outside China's embassy in Kathmandu, the student wing of a leading political party organized this protest. So this is a full-blown diplomatic issue now. What is China's position on this dispute? Well, Beijing leans towards New Delhi's stance here. It does not recognize Nepal's claims. In fact, Beijing calls Lipu Lake a trading post between China and India, no Nepal. And of course, New Delhi's position on this is well known. When Nepal released this political map in 2020, India called this move quote-unquote unilateral. It is unlikely that China did not see this exchange. They've known what's been going on. And yet, China chose to ignore Nepal's claims. which is why Kathmandu is upset. Its objections may not move the needle, though. That's where China stands at the moment. What about Nepal's border dispute with China? Will Prime Minister Prachand raise those too? We say don't count on it. Kathmandu is vocal about its issues with India, but when it comes to China, it takes a more cautious approach, even when there is proof of Chinese encroachment. The Nepal-China border is nearly 1,400 kilometers long. The boundary is demarcated not by barbed wire, but by a chain of pillars. Now, these pillars are several kilometers apart, and this makes identifying the border quite difficult. China, being China, takes advantage of this. In 2020, a report emerged. It said China has occupied 11 areas inside Nepal. That's around 33 hectares of Nepalese land. It's a lot for a small country. China rejected the report, and Nepal said it will solve all border issues diplomatically. Well, 3 years have passed. Has there been any movement? Has Kathmandu made any progress? It hasn't. A Nepalese newspaper recently reported about this. It said there's been no forward movement. A senior government official was quoted, and this is what he said. Nepal and China have not carried out joint boundary work since 2011, so we don't know the actual status of the border in the north. In July last year, we decided to activate the bilateral mechanism to clear the boundary work, but not a single meeting has been held so far. So the question is, will Prime Minister Prachand speak up about this when he visits China later this month? China is hosting the Asian Games, Nepal is participating, and their Prime Minister is expected to join the delegation. Will he talk about China's border games, or just keep harping on Indian land on Chinese maps? Sagarika Chakrabarti, Dhara Shah and Priyadarshini Patil. These women may have never known each other, but they've all made headlines over the same issue. A bitter child custody battle in a foreign nation. They lived outside India, and their child was taken away by the state in the name of safety. The latest case is that of Priyadarshini Patil, 40 years old, lived with her husband in Sydney, had 2 teenage children. A few years back, her son ended up in hospital. Then in 2021, both her children were taken into state custody. The trial to get them back dragged on. This was a custody battle. They had online hearings. Recently, the hearing was deferred to November, and that's when Priyadarshini Patil, the mother, died by suicide. It's a very tragic story, but not a new one. And every time such a case hits the headlines, it becomes a diplomatic incident, and in each case the same questions are raised. Is this a case of child safety, or is it overreach by authorities? Where do you draw the line between cultural differences and safety, and can the state take away your right to be a parent? Our next report explores all of this and more.
A mother's love for her children. Books talk about it, movies laud it, and the world celebrates it. But is a mother's love different in different countries? What happens when it's challenged, when the state blames you of neglect? What happens when your child is taken away from you? These are some of the questions that have plagued the case of Priyadarshini Patil, and the case of many others. Priyadarshini Patil was a 40-year-old IT employee. She was based in Sydney. She lived with her husband and 2 teenage children. All was well until her son got admitted to the hospital. Reports say he was suffering from ulcerative colitis. 6 months of treatment continued, but his parents felt there was no improvement in his condition. So they wanted to move him out of the hospital, and this triggered a child protection case. The doctors filed a complaint against the Patils. They cited child neglect. So child welfare authorities visited their house. They inspected the family and decided to take the 2 children into custody. The custody trial is underway, but Priyadarshini decided to leave the country. She left Australia on August 18th. She said she was returning home to her parents. But she never made it back. Instead, she died by suicide. Priyadarshini's tale is a tragic one, but this is not a first. Indian parents have been involved in custody battles abroad, both with the courts and social welfare departments. There was the case of Sagarika Chakraborty. She was deemed an unfit mother by the government of Norway. She had her children taken away from her and was finally granted custody after years of legal battle. Her story even inspired a Bollywood movie. Then there was the case of Dhara Shah. Her 7-month-old toddler was taken away by authorities in Germany. The case blew up so much that even the Indian government intervened. They called for early repatriation of the baby girl. However, she continues to be in foster care in Germany. But the cases continue to raise an important question. Is this a case of child safety, or is there more behind it? Like Sagarika Chakraborty's case against the government of Norway, it emerged that the Norwegian authorities objected to a couple of things, like parents feeding the children with their hands and sharing a bed with them. These are practices common in Indian households, but in Norway, not so much. The case had racist undertones, but it's just one example. In other cases, there have been allegations of physical abuse, like the Germany baby Ariha case. Ariha was taken away on suspicion of sexual abuse, following what the family says is an accidental injury. Such charges are harder to dismiss unless they're proven to be untrue. So, what is it? Is it cultural differences or parental neglect? Every time a case like this emerges, a lot is written about cultures, the warmth of an Indian family versus the formal nature of a Western family. It's often turned into an us versus them story. Technically, you cannot put all such cases under one blanket. Every country has different rules. But can a state just decide to take away your right to be a parent? Is this persecution by child protection agencies, or overreach by the authorities in general, or simply a case of a clash of cultures? Aside from physical abuse, which is an obvious red line, where does one draw the line otherwise? Between cultural difference and safety, and ensure that families and lives are not being destroyed in the process.
Pakistan's army chief had a busy weekend. He held a very important meeting with 100 people. They were not soldiers. They were not senior army officers, not even arms suppliers. These 100 people were businessmen. That's right. Pakistan's army chief is dropping the pretense. Pakistan's army is dropping the pretense. Army Chief Asim Munir has decided to get his hands dirty. His project? Fixing Pakistan's economy. This meeting took place in Lahore at the Corps Commander's house. The business community was represented by the LCCI, that's the Lahore Chamber of Commerce and Industry. You won't find pictures or videos of this meeting. It was held behind closed doors. So what exactly happened? The Lahore Chamber statement reveals some details. The businessmen had a set of demands, like reducing income taxes, delaying energy taxes to winter months, and controlling the value of Pakistan's national currency. General Asim Munir granted some of them. For example, he promised to tax forex dealers. This will reroute remittances from unofficial to official channels. He also promised to keep the exchange rate quote-unquote transparent. Now, just to be clear, Pakistan does have a civilian government. They also have a caretaker finance minister. Yet, who do the business leaders meet? The army chief. This latest meeting tells us two things. Number one, it shows how bad the situation is. Over the weekend, traders held a nationwide strike in Pakistan. Thousands of shops were shuttered. What were they protesting? Higher inflation, higher taxes, and the falling Pakistani rupee. Now, to give you some idea, Pakistan's latest inflation is around 27%. Food prices are up 40%. So the economic condition is really bad. People are already out on the streets protesting. If the outrage grows, it could mean more trouble. Which brings us to the second factor, the army's direct interest. Until now, General Munir was not focused on the economy. He was focused on Imran Khan. But now he's making a pivot. And frankly, he does not have an option. What if this public outrage drags on till the elections? What if it turns people towards Imran Khan? So Pakistan's economic crisis is also a strategic one for the army. Hence, General Asim Munir's interest. But does he have a plan? He did mention some details to the Lahore business community, like fighting the grey economy. What does that mean? What is the grey economy? It's the economy that operates outside government control. They don't pay taxes. General Asim Munir says this grey economy is 3 times bigger than Pakistan's official economy. I know it sounds dubious, but either way, the army wants to fight it, to bring the grey economy under the tax regime. He also proposed privatization of some public companies. He did not say which ones. And finally, he pitched for outside investments. He said countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE and China could bet on Pakistan. How much money is he expecting? General Asim Munir says, and listen to this, he says he's expecting up to $100 billion. That's billion with a B, 100 billion. And how much investment did Pakistan get last year? $1.3 billion. At this rate, just 76 years to go. The fact is, the army cannot solve Pakistan's problems. This is not warfare or strategy, and even then, you wouldn't trust the generals in Rawalpindi. This is an army that has lost every single war it has fought. The report card is a big zero, yet the same generals think they can turn the economy around. Clearly not fans of specialization. And it's not like the army chief has nothing on his plate. Last week, 9 soldiers were killed in a suicide blast. Today, a military helicopter crashed during training. 3 soldiers were killed. But what does General Asim Munir do? He meets business leaders to talk inflation. We can expect more such meetings and decisions in the coming months because Pakistan's elections have been pushed to 2024. Chances are the caretaker government's term will also be extended. So we could see a lot more of General Asim Munir, less in barracks and more in conference halls. Our next story is about Italy. Their foreign minister, Antonio Tajani, is currently in China, and on top of his agenda is the BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiative. It was once hailed as Chinese President Xi Jinping's project of the century, but in recent times, it has become the road to nowhere, Belt and Road Blocks. That's what it's called. And now Italy wants out. In 2019, it became the first member of the European Union and the only G7 nation to join China's BRI. 4 years have passed since. The pact expires in December this year, and Italy does not plan to renew it. What does it mean for their relationship with China and for Xi Jinping's dream project? Our next report tells you.
In 2019, Italy angered the US and Europe. It did the unexpected. Italy became the first European Union member and the only G7 state to join the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a Chinese scheme. It envisions rebuilding the old Silk Road by connecting China with mainly Asia and Europe. Under this scheme, China has financed and built vast amounts of infrastructure, like power plants, railways, highways, and ports. Countries that joined the scheme saw it as a tool to increase investment, to boost their exports. This was especially true for Italy. It was facing economic turmoil when it decided to join the BRI. But over time, the outlook has changed. Many now call the BRI a debt trap, a state-backed campaign for global dominance. This again is true for Italy. 4 years have passed since Italy signed the agreement. Recently, the Italian Defense Minister, Guido Crosetto, called it an improvised and atrocious act. Earlier in May, Italian PM Giorgia Meloni called it a big mistake. This weekend, Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani also agreed, only in a more diplomatic way. He said the plan didn't bring expected results, and now he's in China. As the most senior Italian official to visit the country since the pandemic, it's obvious that the BRI is likely top of the agenda. After all, Italy's anti-BRI sentiment could be actionable any time now. The agreement will expire in December this year. Italy does not plan to renew it. And this isn't too shocking. Since Italy joined the BRI, its exports to China increased from $15.6 billion to $19.9 billion. But Chinese exports to Italy grew much more dramatically. No prizes for guessing who really benefited. Now let's look at investments. China has invested $24 billion in Italy since 2005. but only 1.83 billion of that since Italy joined the BRI. Clearly, joining the BRI did not do Italy much good. If Italy does pull out of the BRI, it will be a big blow to Xi's crown jewel, especially as the scheme is already struggling. Under the BRI, China's lending began slipping before 2020. When the pandemic hit, this was only accelerated. Yet a lot of projects continued, and Beijing had little control over things on the ground. In recent years, there have been an increasing number of reports. They talk about BRI construction failures, project cancellations by BRI partner countries, or by Chinese companies due to financial problems. Sometimes BRI projects lead to nowhere, quite literally. Like a BRI-funded railway, it ends in the middle of a field in Kenya. On top of this, for many countries, taking loans has become unsustainable. One of the biggest examples is Sri Lanka. It defaulted on a mountain of debt last year. Or look at Pakistan. It owes nearly 1/3 of its foreign debt to China. Now, Zambia is debt-laden and trying to work out a restructuring plan with China, which is its biggest bilateral creditor. There is growing outrage over the BRI. While for some countries the reasons are economic, for others they are political. European countries view China as a rival. To them, China isn't a partner, even if it pretends to be one, and an Italian withdrawal reflects this outlook. So, whatever be the reason, China's BRI is being pushed away. But Beijing is sticking to its preferred state, that of being in denial. After all, it's China's passion project that builds inroads to its visionary goal of overseas control. But if Italy backs out of the agreement, it will be a body blow to Beijing's ambitions, whether it admits it or not.
Now let's turn our attention to Africa. 2 coups have taken place in a span of about a month, both in former French colonies, in West Africa's Niger and Central Africa's Gabon. And in both cases, they were led by members of the Presidential Guard. These were men who were supposed to protect the presidents. Instead, they put them in detention. Now, in both Niger and Gabon, the presidents are being held in their respective presidential palaces. So a lot of similarities, but that's where the list ends. There are differences too. In Niger, for example, the coup is overtly fueled by an anti-France sentiment. And it's a very strong sentiment. The new junta are relying on it for popular support. They hope to draw legitimacy from this anti-France sentiment. So every other day, there's a new salvo fired at the French. First, Paris was asked to recall its ambassador. Then the junta targeted French troops. France has a permanent troop presence in Niger. The junta told them to remove the soldiers, to take the French soldiers away. France ignored both the demands. Paris says it does not recognize Niger's new junta. It says Mohamed Bazoum is Niger's rightful leader. He's the ousted president, Mohamed Bazoum. Even in detention, he refuses to step down, and the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has showered praise on him. Macron says he speaks to Bazoum every day. And all this has incensed Niger's military.
The government of the Republic of Niger has followed with dismay the remarks made by the President of the French Republic during his address to the French ambassadors. These remarks constitute a further blatant interference in Niger's internal affairs.
So France has become an unwanted guest, one that refuses to leave. And this is the line taken by Niger's junta and their supporters. And there are thousands of these supporters. They back the new military leaders. They're targeting France. They've surrounded the French military base near Niger's capital. The city is called Niamey. There's a French base near it. It houses some 1,500 French troops. The coup supporters want them out. For days now, the people of Niger have been protesting here. Tens of thousands have surrounded the French base. They're demonstrating peacefully and creatively. They've been displaying coffins bearing the French flag. It signifies the death of French influence in Niger. Women have been using cooking utensils to demand that the French leave.
They defy our governments, they defy our laws, and they, who call themselves Democrats, do not respect democracy. That's why we women thought that the men insisted, they persisted. We planned to change the order of departure to bring out our utensils, to come to make noise so that the message can pass. That they say that it is not the men, it is all the Nigerians who demand their departure.
Stages have been set up around the base, musicians have been performing there, people have been on a sit-in for 2 nights now, and they say they won't leave until the French are gone.
France will leave. This is our home. They are going to leave whether they want to or not. If they won't leave, we are here. We are going to stay. Even if it's 100 years, we're going to stay here. We are determined and France will leave.
The French were forced to leave Mali and Burkina Faso too. 2 other West African nations that have also seen coups in recent years. But in Niger, Paris is resisting. It has threatened to retaliate in case of violence and is hoping that somehow the coup will be reversed, perhaps with intervention from the West African bloc called ECOWAS. That's the Economic Community of West African States. The acronym is ECOWAS, ECOWAS. And while all of this is happening in Niger, there is relative calm in Gabon. Gabon too was a French colony, and it also houses a permanent French military force. But so far, the anti-French rhetoric in Gabon has been subdued. Instead, the anger is focused on the Bongo family, the family that has ruled Gabon for about 55 years. President Ali Bongo has been ousted and is in detention. His son, Noureddin Bongo Valentin, has also been arrested. Their loyalists are also being imprisoned. Meanwhile, this happened today.
Je jure devant Dieu et le peuple gabonais.
I swear before God and the Gabonese people to loyally preserve the republican regime, to respect and uphold respect in the transitional charter and the law, to carry out my duties for the higher interests of the people, to preserve the gains of democracy, the independence of the homeland, and the integrity of the nation's territory.
That is Gabon's new president of the transition, General Brice Oligui Nguema. He was sworn in today in a ceremony full of pomp and pageantry. It's not like the brusque declaration in Niger where it was just announced that General Abdul Rahmane Tiani was in charge. Gabon's coup looks more aristocratic. In Niger, the junta had said it will hand back power to civilians in 3 years. Negotiations are on with neighboring nations. The West African bloc ECOWAS wants a 9-month transition period. Algeria has proposed a 6-month period for the junta to give up power. Now, none of these have been accepted, but talks are still on. In Gabon, we still have no transition timeline. Even though there's a president of the transition now, the one you just saw, Gabon's military has said that it will proceed, quote unquote, without haste. That a new constitution will be drawn up, that new democratic institutions will be put in place. It sounds like a long drawn-out process, especially if they go about it without haste. Add to all of this the fact that Gabon's new leader is related to the Bongo family. He's a cousin of Ali Bongo, with supposed ties to his half-sister Pascaline, who loyally served in their father Omar Bongo's regime and allegedly promised to take care of the family. When you consider all of this, then Gabon's coup seems a little different, less about doing away with French exploitation and more about internal politics. France has condemned the coup in Gabon. It has suspended military cooperation with the new regime, but it's not antagonizing the new rulers like it is in Niger. That may change in the near future, but it could also be that Gabon's new leader takes a leaf out of his cousin's book, keeping ties with France alive for mutual benefit. We can't see them, we can't feel them, but they're everywhere. I know it's only Monday and this sounds like the beginning of a horror movie, but let me tell you, it may as well be. I'm talking about microplastics. They're in our land, water and air, also in the clouds. Microplastics are in our bodies too, in our lungs, our hearts, our bowels, even in the blood that pulses through us. And now, microplastics could be in our brains too. A new study is out. It says once in the brain, microplastics can increase the risk of a number of problems like inflammation, neurological disorders, and even diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So what are microplastics and how can you reduce your exposure to them? Our next report tells you.
No corner of the planet is free from microplastics, so it's about time we talk about them. As the name suggests, these are minuscule fragments of plastic. It's a broad category which accommodates any piece of plastic less than 5 millimeters in size. Microplastics are everywhere, existing as invisible specks of eroded plastic. They come from our candy wrappers or long-forgotten toothbrushes and live in our clouds, laundry bins, even our food. Like tea, salt, milk, seafood, honey, sugar, vegetables, beer, and soft drinks. Tap water contains plastic, and bottled water contains even more. These microplastics enter our bodies, then happily float in the human bloodstream. And new research suggests that they could make their way into our brains. The study was held by the University of Vienna. It was conducted on mice. These mice ingested water containing plastic. Within 2 hours, plastic had made its way to the mice's brains. This shows how easily plastic could be sneaking into ours. Doctors say if they do, plastic particles could increase risks of a number of problems like inflammation, neurological disorders, and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. These are long-term issues. People can also suffer from short-term health effects like cognitive impairment and damage caused to nervous system by toxins. What's worse is that microplastics aren't just consumed by drinking water. People nasally inhale plastics too and even eat them. Then plastic infiltrates most parts of our body, like our organs, including our brains, lungs, hearts, even placenta and breast milk. The discovery of microplastics in our bodies is relatively new, so we don't fully understand how they affect us. But research is underway, and here's what it says so far. Microplastics are linked to negative health outcomes. No shocker there. They increase the risk of obesity, diabetes, reproductive disorders, and neurological problems. So the question is, how do we protect ourselves from plastic? Because plastic is everywhere. It's impossible to be completely safe, but some precautionary actions are within our control. For starters, we need to rethink how we eat and drink. Foods are usually sealed in plastic. They're associated with cleanliness or purity, when actually this is one of the biggest reasons for exposure to microplastics. Plastics often get on our food due to packaging, and the plastic shedding increases if it's exposed to heat. So hot food inside a polythene means more plastic in our food. So we could reduce the risk of plastic packaging or heating food inside plastic bowls. Secondly, switching to natural fibers helps, like wearing cotton or wool instead of polyester, since it could reduce the amount of plastic we inhale. The fact is, we can't worry about every little bit of plastic we encounter because it's everywhere. It's impossible to eliminate the risk. So the goal isn't to live in fear. It's simply to take precautions and minimize the risk. After all, life in plastic isn't always fantastic.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. It was a crash and burn for the Burning Man Festival in the United States. 72,000 people got stranded after a rainstorm turned the festival into mud. The festival site, rather, into mud. Landing once on the moon was not enough for the Chandrayaan-3 lander. The Vikram lander conducted a hop experiment, landing on the moon once again. And move over Jack Sparrow. There's a new pirate in town. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is sporting an eye patch to cover bruises from a fall while jogging. Scholz says he's excited for the memes to come. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1998, Google was founded by Larry Page and Sergey Brin. This was while they were PhD students at Stanford University, initially called BackRub. It began as a research project. The duo wanted to create a tool that would deliver relevant search results to readers. 25 years later, Google is the world's largest search engine. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.